Yeah, no, 10:15.
Oh!
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll be quite a couple of back.
Oh, right. Julian's objection.
That was good, yeah.
It was just the moment when you realise halfway through. It's like,
Can you just 5 minutes?
All stand. Coronial court is now in session. Please be seated.
Thank you, Anna. I call Superintendent Jody Nobbs.
Superintendent Knowles, do you want to tell the truth in court?
Yes, Your Honour, thank you.
Thank you.
So could you please tell the court your full name and your current rank and where you're stationed?
Superintendent Jody Nobbs, currently stationed, attached to Northern Division, Nhulunbuy Police Station.
Northern Division at Nhulunbuy, did you say?
Correct, yes.
You have prepared a number of statements and interviews that are relevant to Her Honour's inquest. The first is, I think, the interview you did on the 29th of November 2019, is that right?
Yes.
Your Honour, that's found in the brief of evidence, surely. And then there's a statement on the 4th of December 2019, is that correct? That you did, Superintendent. 4th of December 2019?
Yes, correct.
And there's a number of attachments to those documents. Your Honour, the interview is at 7-101.
Yes.
Superintendent, have you had an opportunity to read through those recently?
Yes, I have.
You also gave evidence at the trial in relation to the charges brought against Constable Rolfe, is that right?
Correct, yes.
And have you read through the transcript of evidence that you gave at that trial?
No, I haven't.
If needed, I'm going to take you to those documents. But, Your Honour, I am going to try to stick within a time frame. There is at least two and a half hours, I think, that my learned friends will need to examine Superintendent Knowles.
Yes.
And I note that much of the relevant evidence is set out in great detail in statements and transcript elsewhere.
Thank you.
Superintendent, can I take you first to your history of policing in the Northern Territory? When did you join the force?
1998.
And how old were you when you joined?
21 or 22. 22, I think. Long time ago.
Where were you first posted as a police officer?
Alice Springs.
You have, I think, spent about 25 years in policing in Central Australia since that time, is that right?
So of my 25 years, 18 years in Central Australia and 6 in Darwin and 1 in Nhulunbuy.
6 in Darwin, 1 in Nhulunbuy.
Well, almost 1 in Nhulunbuy, correct.
Okay. So you've got a wealth of experience to draw on. Can I ask you some questions that go to the history of policing over that period of time?
Certainly.
You did your initial training in Darwin, is that right?
Correct, yes.
And do you recall during that training, I would draw that, where had you come from before you joined the police force?
Western Sydney.
And what made you join the police force in the Northern Territory?
General passion to be a police officer in terms of my my young history, family issues, so around wanting to support my community. Generally wanted to join the New South Wales Police Service, but couldn't get in at that point in time. So I was interested in trying any location as a bit of an adventure to get the requisite sort of qualifications to go back to New South Wales, but fell in love with the Northern Territory and I'm now here 25 years later.
Had you had any experience or relationships with Aboriginal people before you came to the Territory?
Very limited.
Do you recall during the time of your training as a very young officer, learning about cross-cultural issues, communication with Aboriginal people?
Yes, certainly.
What did that involve?
So there was an elements within our college training around cross-cultural awareness. We had presentations from cross-cultural awareness advocate agencies. We done some work at Bagot community. Multitude of our various lessons around policy had intricate cross-cultural elements associated with them, so such as Unganunga guidelines within our interviewing frameworks and things such as that. So there was, I guess, a broad cross-cultural theme that permeated through most of our policy sort of lessons.
For the transcript, that's the Anunga guidelines, ANUNGA
Correct.
guideline. That relate to how you interview people from different cultural backgrounds, correct?
Correct. That's just one example, I guess.
And we know that cross-cultural training has developed over the course of the time that you've been in the police force. You also do some important learning on the job, of course, is that right?
That's where most of my learnings occurred.
Can you tell Her Honour what your experience has been working in remote communities in Central Australia?
Yes, certainly. So my history, as I've indicated, 18 years in Central Australia. The large proportion of my career has been operational policing. I've had the pleasure in my mind to have lived in most communities within Central Australia. My passion's for bush policing, so I typically gravitate towards remote policing. Lived in Harts Range in the early 2000s for 3 years. Worked in Papunya, Hermansburg, Ali Kurung, Tea Tree, Harts Range, Hermansburg. I might be repeating some of these now, but a number of locations over the years, and it's been a pleasure to have lived in those locations.
Why do you say that?
It's just a different pace. I've truly, like most people, I believe, joined the job to make a difference within my community. I feel the cut and thrust of policing within an urban environment doesn't tend towards an opportunity to truly engage and truly become part of a community and play basketball, which is I'm not very good at, but it's a passion of mine with community members. So it's they're the sort of opportunities that present remote policing, and that's, I guess, why I love remote policing and gravitate towards that. So it's truly being a part of your community.
In the number of communities that you listed, Yuendamu wasn't one of them, is that right?
Correct.
What's the closest you got to Yuendamu in terms
I've worked at Papunya, I've worked at Hermansburg, and I've worked in Kintore as sort of that broad Western Tanami type region.
Just remind us how far away Papunya is, for example, from...
As the crow flies, 120 kilometres.
And across Papunya, Hermansburg and Kintore, I'm right that there's many family relationships that relate to Yuendamu, correct?
Correct.
And many Warlpiri people that you interact with.
Correct.
When you were a police officer in the remote communities, what ranks did you hold?
So, constable, senior constable. I've never been a substantive sergeant with any of these locations. So, constable, senior constable, and acting sergeant. And then more recently, a superintendent in charge of the broader oversight of remote communities.
I'll come to that shortly. In terms of your understanding of resourcing on the ground, you've had an experience of the different levels of policing there, including acting as sergeant and therefore trying to get resources in to bolster the community when you're short-staffed, correct?
Correct.
When you're acting sergeant, who is it that you ask up to if you're running low on resourcing?
So in the context of the southern desert, so the command structure is your constables report to your sergeants report to your senior sergeant, and your senior sergeant reports to your superintendent. So the senior sergeant's role is predominantly around general administration and HR support.
And where's the senior sergeant physically located?
In Alice Springs.
Similarly, the superintendent of police that's attached to the Southern Command, who sits over the top of them, is based in Alice Springs.
Correct.
During your experiences working in remote communities, did you work with ACPOs?
Yes.
Can you tell Her Honour what you believe to be the value of the ACPO?
Oh, their value is immense. They're a substantial conduit between police and the community. They're a fantastic tool as a role modelling opportunity. They're fantastic for cross-cultural awareness. They know their community. They generally hold, a role as a leader within the community as well. They have the same not the same powers, but they swear an oath also to uphold the law, and they have powers that are relative to that as well. So they're an immense benefit within a remote community.
During the time that you were, what's the youngest that you were working in a remote community?
22.
At that time, in terms of learning about how to communicate effectively with the community, where do you draw most of your assistance from?
Well, again, it's generally looking and modelling from those above me, both positive and negatively. So, I've always had my role models that I've looked at in terms of the way they communicate. Communication's a perennial issue for us. We don't do it very well. We don't always do it very well. Some people do it better than others. So I guess I've tried to model my methodologies on those that I see that do it really well, and then add my own little flair to it, I guess. But so it's basically trial and error and learning.
In communities like Papunya and Kintore, did you develop relationships with elders to assist you with the communication?
Certainly, yes.
How did you do that?
It's a slow burn. It's never just an inferred or implied that you will have that. It's around mutual respect and mutual accountability. It's having courageous conversations. It's having the ability to step back and go, yeah, I've got it wrong, and I guess it's about trust building. So it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a period of time. But once you establish that, you're well placed going forward. But once you abuse that, then it's gone. So
with your work in those communities, Papunya, Hermannsburg, Kintore, did you develop a good relationship with the ACPOs that you worked with?
Yes.
Did you maintain those relationships after you left the community?
Yes.
How did you do that?
Look, certainly as it relates to Jabberjari Spencer, he was a man that I had the utmost respect for. Every time he'd come to Alice Springs, if we bumped into each other, we would have chats and laughs and reflections on certain things. And it wasn't just I've now left the community and you have no purpose for me going forward. You can't help but establish respect and friendships and relationships over time. So,
do you agree that that is critical to you being able to do your job effectively in the community?
Correct.
Respect and relationship.
If you don't have it, you might as well not do your job.
And in terms of the role of the sergeant, this is relevant to some questions I want to ask you towards the end of your evidence, but what sort of role do they play in establishing the tone and the culture of a particular station out bush?
Critical. So, that's most impressionable constables model their behaviour on their immediate superior. So I guess it's critical for the sergeant to establish the parameters in what is and isn't acceptable in terms of what their expectations are, not only in terms of behaviour but around the manner in which they would want the community policed. So the methodology is inherent within that, whether it's going to be a more community orientated policing model or a more punitive sort of policing model. So they set the tone and the tenor.
And what about when you're in town? For the sergeants in Alice Springs, how important are they in terms of establishing culture and leadership?
Oh, certainly, again, equally as important, but I guess through a different lens. So they're more around modelling behaviour and establishing what is and isn't acceptable within a police station environment.
When young police officers join the force, is it your experience that they're often looking for role models?
Yeah, agreed. Look, again, without being overly altruistic, I truly believe that everyone joins the police force for the same reason. That is, we want to make a difference in our community. And to me, particularly being, although a long time ago, an impressionable constable that's come in, the first thing I've done was looked around and trying to establish the best way that you do business.
It's inevitable, isn't it? And I'm not being overly critical. You're often going to get young men and women who are still developing their own maturity, who end up as police officers with a lot of power, correct?
Certainly.
And it's critical to have effective leadership for those young people so that they're shaped in a way that makes them responsible police officers.
Correct.
And the role of sergeant is critical in shaping those young officers, correct?
Certainly, particularly in the context of the community in which we operate here, particularly for people such as myself that come from Western Sydney. This was such a foreign location for me, the culture within my community. I had no appreciation of those things before I got here, so you kind of behind the eight ball immediately of coming out of college, your head spinning with all this information, theoretic information, and then to have to apply it in this foreign location is sort of really challenging.
When you were a young officer, 22, 23, and you came to Alice Springs for the first time, you are having to police in challenging environments often, is that right?
Correct, yes.
You're having to deal with vulnerable people in challenging environments, correct?
Yes.
A number of people that you have to detain are severely intoxicated, is that right?
Yes.
Police are given the responsibility to pick up intoxicated people and put them in protective custody, correct?
Correct.
That's often challenging for police.
Yes.
And you often have to do overnight shifts that are arduous, is that right?
Yes.
Do you recall as a young officer yourself developing some negative attitudes towards the people that you had to arrest?
I think negative attitudes is probably a very simplistic question. I mean, no disrespect for saying that,
Sure.
but I certainly acknowledge and recall acknowledging how pervasive and prodigious the issues that we had within our community were at the time and remain today. So the things I've seen people do to people they purport to love have just been sort of mind-blowing. So as a young person, seeing some of these horrendous things that I've seen, I guess saddened is probably a more appropriate response rather than negative, or whatever your question was.
Negative attitudes was the question I asked you, and you're right, it's simplistic, and I'm going to suggest to you that it's an important dialogue, so I'm going to keep going unless someone stops me. Superintendent, when you're a young officer, you're dealing with trauma, is that right?
Yes.
Did you receive any training at any stage in your time in the police about how you safeguard yourself as an officer when you're confronted with that trauma?
Well, safeguard, I guess, that's again fairly nuanced. So safeguard in terms of the immediate response.
How you protect yourself.
So obviously the foundation, the 10 safety principles is your response to the situation. But if you're talking about from a mental health welfare perspective, early in the career, it's probably not as refined as it presently is. Early in the career, it was more around the social club or social interactions, or probably some unhealthy practices around liquor consumption and things such as that. So there's been an evolution since those early days in my career, but so those sorts of things aren't the go-to now. It's more around support services and things such as that, which I've been a user of many times over many years. So it's more healthier ways to deal with it.
Are you familiar with the phrase trauma-informed counselling or trauma-informed work?
Yeah, in a broad sense.
Have you had any trauma-informed training recently delivered by the Northern Territory Police?
No.
I'll come back to those issues, but during your time as a young officer in Alice Springs, did you hear your superiors use racist terms? I'm talking about overt racism, like referring to Aboriginal people as bushkerns or niggers or Neanderthals.
Not that I could genuinely recall.
What about amongst the young constables? Do you recall any discussions about that, barbecues or anything like that, use of those terms?
Again, not that I could generally recall in such a derogatory fashion. As I said to you, I guess there is discussions around some of the egregious things that we've seen in terms of trauma, but not in such a derogatory fashion.
Do you agree with me that police are, you're a microcosm of the community, aren't you?
Correct, yes.
You're going to get people with different personalities and different life experiences.
Yes.
Just remind us of the year again that you joined.
1998, May of 98.
At that time, do you recall hearing those terms I just used in the general community, used in Alice Springs at all?
Yes, it's. I consider Alice Springs, and I've seen it a community that I'm passionate about. I've seen it sort of deteriorate over the years as a relatively intolerant community. So yeah, I've seen and heard that across sections of our community.
Do you say in the police station that you've never heard or seen those or heard that language?
No, look, again, to me, I think if there is that language is generally communicated with the targets that are being picked. I'd like to think that my approach to conduct such as that is well known, and no one would say things such as that to me, because my response would be quite clearly quite decisive in terms of it. So
I'm going to show you, well, I ask that you be provided with MFIC. I'll give you my copy of it. Yeah, sorry, thank you.
thank you.
Just have a look at the first page, if you will, Superintendent. You see there, the sender of a text message in February 2019 is Constable Rolfe. He's texting a friend that Alice Springs is the Wild West with fuck all rules in the job, really. Is that ever been your experience, that you thought that being in Alice Springs as a young officer meant that you were somewhere with no rules?
No, Your Honour.
You see the next text message is Constable Rolfe to another person, and he says, I'm at Borroloola, a random community on the coast, because they're rioting, but we came up last time they did this and smashed the whole community. So this time, as soon as we arrive, they start behaving. Was it ever in your contemplation that a constable working in the Southern Desert Division would go into an Aboriginal community and then, where there was rioting, and then boast about smashing the whole community?
No.
You have a look at page 2. You see there an exchange between Constable Rolfe and somebody else who I won't name, where he says that he suggests he's got a licence to towel up locals.
Yes.
Ever in your contemplation that a constable under your command would boast about having a licence to towel up the locals?
No.
What would you do if you became aware that a constable in your command was boasting about those sorts of things when he had carried weaponry and had a responsibility for policing the community?
Look, it'd be clearly a situation where I'd be dealing with the constable in relation to those matters. If I had something as I have now in terms of an evidence piece in respect to a particular behaviour. I'm a prescribed member within the Police Administration Act, and certainly comments such as these are comments that would have the tendency to bring the organisation into disrepute and erode the confidence the community would have in police. So accordingly, I would operate within the Police Administration Act to deal with it through the formal disciplinary process. That said, I'd still would be having conversations to see what underpins this thinking, because I want to have, rather than just in isolation a disciplinary action, I'd also want to have try to have an appreciation of how and why we got to the stage that we've got to. Is it something that I could potentially influence more broadly?
Sure, you want to know, wouldn't you, whether or not their sergeant is aware of using that language. Correct. And boasting about toweling people?
I'd certainly want to have appreciation of how widespread it is and whether this was a symptom of something more egregious.
And you'd want to know, wouldn't you, is it a symptom of some mental health decline, or is it a symptom of someone having nasty racist attitudes towards Aboriginal people?
Certainly.
If you have a look, please, at page 3, you see there text message from serving police officer to Constable Rolfe about the duty belt, etc. That's the first one. And then Constable Rolfe texts back about the belt. And then skip one minute. In that same exchange, the constable at the top of the page says, "Heard you had a rough arvo yesterday, grubby fucks." And Constable Rolfe writes back, "Nah, bruh, just slightly annoying, ha, coons, man." And you'll see if you just scan your eyes down that page, Constable Rolfe also refers to Neanderthals when he's texting somebody. And then there's an exchange between another serving police officer and Constable Rolfe, where the other serving police officer texts and says, "Who was the silly bitch?" And Constable Rolfe says, "Fuck no, some white bitch who thinks she's Aboriginal." And the other constable says, "Lying in the dirt, piss, doing a fucking good impression." I just want to take you to one further exchange, right over the page. A sergeant then, who you'll know the name of, but I won't say at the moment, texts Constable Rolfe, "Cool, as long as we got him, had a run, hey?" And then Constable Rolfe to that sergeant, "Yeah, the bush cops would never have been able to get him, impossible for them." And then Constable Rolfe to the sergeant, "So it was good we went, the bush cops fucked up as usual, but that just meant we had a run instead of getting him cordoned properly, so it's all good." I'll just stop there. By the time you get to that text message, if you had known about that, you realise, don't you, that there's a number of police officers in Alice Springs who have revealed to have those attitudes and to be sharing them with each other. And one of them is a sergeant who's supposed to be exercising discipline over younger officers. And they're using racist terms, and that you've got a young officer boasting about toweling up locals and going into the community and smashing it up. What would you do about that if you found out while you were a superintendent of it?
Yeah, again, I acknowledge that it's a broader issue broader than an isolated issue, and it's certainly attitudes that I wouldn't want permeating across what I considered to be a very necessary functional unit. So I'd be certainly dealing not only with the sergeant but any of the officers that shared those views in terms of whether that's through trying to get an appreciation of how and why we've got to the stage that we've got to, assessing whether there's any welfare considerations necessary, but then also reasserting unequivocally that I have no tolerance for those sorts of attitudes and there's disciplinary actions that will need to flow.
You see, if down that page, this is July 2019, and the sergeant, who there has a leadership role in relation to Constable Zach, writes, this is in the same exchange where he's suggesting that the bush cops fucked up as usual, so they had a run. And the sergeant writes, "Good job, I'll let Nobs know the details. I want to do more of this stuff. That's a couple we've got for Nobs." And then Constable Rolfe, "Yeah, I'm hell keen. It seems he's getting on board." And then the sergeant, "These bush coons aren't used to people going after them." And then Constable Rolfe, "Yeah, bush cops blow my mind. I'll tell you about these dudes when I see you." And then Constable Rolfe to his sergeant, We could just cut a few people and rejig the team. Nob should be loving us at the moment. What do you think about that, Superintendent?
Look, it's certainly disappointing, incredibly disappointing. And I've expressed it a number of times before, I'm a strong supporter of the IRT concept as a national best practice model. And I've advocated quite strongly for the IRT in the past and continue to advocate for an IRT concept going forward. So that's really sort of derailed any sort of reasonable and clinical and considered conversations that anyone would have in relation to IRT concept. So I find it extremely disappointing and quite frustrating.
And the idea that they're boasting about smashing up a community, that's the exact opposite, isn't it, to what you want from a disciplined IRT team who you might need to call on in difficult circumstances. Do you agree?
It certainly is. It's certainly, in terms of a deployment, sometimes a deployment requires swift and decisive action. But certainly the notion that we go into a community and smash it up is just counterintuitive with what we're trying to achieve.
And can I suggest to you, Superintendent, it's the exact opposite of what you just said is important in terms of you building relationships in communities and developing trust between communities and police.
Correct.
Now that those text messages have been flushed out, you're aware, aren't you, that it's caused some pain and reflection amongst members of the police force, correct?
Yes, I am.
I think in an editorial piece in the NT Independent, one former member was complaining that the last bastion of camaraderie has now been destroyed because police officers can't feel free to talk to each other in that language. What do you think about that?
Oh, look, there's no justification for anyone speaking to anyone in such vulgar language, but yeah, I don't think that's the case, but it's certainly disappointing that that's I won't say the prevailing attitude, but it's certainly an attitude of some.
You had no idea, of course, that those text exchanges were being sent.
No.
Do you think that there's, in some respects, although it might be painful, it's actually healthy to flush that stuff out and become aware of it so that you can deal with it?
It's certainly, I agree. It's we're an agency that is constantly trying to grow and develop, and sometimes it takes for us to, or someone potentially to check our blind spot and tell us that we're not quite up to the par as it relates to certain matters, and it's that robust and considered conversation that brings about meaningful reform. It's ultimately, we do, as I indicated before, want to operate within our community to make a difference within our community. So I'm open to constructive criticism.
In terms of the evidence you gave earlier, you said you don't think anybody would be comfortable to use that language in front of you because they know that you wouldn't approve of it and you'd deal with it. Knowing it now, what do you think the way forward is in terms of educating the police and building back morale?
Well, I think the way forward is a continuation of the journey that we're on. We're the highest representative police service in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation within the police service across Australia by far. So that's a starting point. We're a much more of a multicultural police service today, a representative of the community in which we operate. So they're the sorts of things that really sort of move the needle in my mind. We're more geared towards building frameworks and processes that are aligned with community policing methodologies and local decision-making and frameworks and integration across community activities. So they're the sorts of things, I guess, that inherent within that is building trust and building respect and building relationships and then forming relationships on a human level. That's, I think, where we need to go, and it's a continuation of that journey.
Superintendent, I'm making you twist your head around, and I don't mean to. So feel free to just focus on the
Your Honour.
It's fine, just be comfortable.
Superintendent, with the development of that framework, do you agree that it's important to ensure that wherever possible Aboriginal people are promoted within the force to the most senior positions?
Certainly, yes.
At the moment, I think the most senior, if I remember the evidence correctly from Assistant Commissioner Worst, the most senior Aboriginal ranking officer is a sergeant. Ideally, you'd want to see commissioned officers going forward wherever possible. Do you agree?
Certainly.
I'm going to come back to your position as Superintendent of Police attached to the Southern Command Southern Desert Division, which is a position that you held in November 2019. Is that correct?
Yes.
At that time, you were responsible for 11 remote police stations. We have an organisational chart. I don't know if Beck has it handy there. It's at 19-57, and that can come on to the screen. I think it demonstrates, Superintendent, the enormity of the role that you perform when you're a superintendent.
But you were also in that position in July of 2019, is that correct?
That's, you held it at 2.5 years.
Correct. To start of 2018 through to late 20.
Have you gone back to reflect on what was happening in July 2019 at the time of these text messages?
I'd have to refer to my notes. I know I had a number of IRT deployments from, so the most notable was my deployment in August of 18 to the Alikrung riots. I had deployments to Barrow Creek in April. I had deployments to a number of locations consecutively across the months, middle of the year in 19.
Did they involve use of force?
They involved, no. They certainly involved the deployment of IRT, and in most cases, so if I deploy IRT, I generally deploy IRT, dog and drone concurrently. So each of the deployments have generally me articulating what my commander's intent is to Sergeant Bowens in most cases. They generally have a mission in mind, and each of those occasions, as communicated back to me, that the objective was achieved without injury or incident. So nothing in terms of it being reported to me in terms of force or certainly not any excessive force, but force being applied in those cases.
The 9th of July texts appear to suggest that there was a use of force, possibly.
Can I have a very quick moment just to refer to my notes and just to reference to...
It's page 1. Oh, sorry. It's also page 1 of the index.
Your Honour, I don't recall a deployment in July. I did have an incident at Harts Range that I required a surge response to, but I don't recall that being IRT, so I don't recall any IRT deployments in July that I had an involvement with. Not saying that that wasn't the case, but not that I could recall.
Superintendent, what about March 2019? I'm referring to the Borroloola text. I'm out at Borroloola, they're rioting. We came up last time they did this and smashed up the community.
So IRT sit within Alice Springs as a support capability. So they're under the Alice Springs superintendent in terms of they're in charge of the IRT, and they're ultimately their deployment. Borroloola doesn't sit within the Southern Desert Division, so as an end user of IRT, I would utilise them and call upon their assistance within the Southern Desert. Equally, the superintendent of Barclay or any other superintendent would call upon them to operate within their area of responsibility. So if there was a Borroloola deployment that, in my mind, I'm not aware of, but it would have been coordinated by the Barclay superintendent at their request to...
look at that org chart, if you can see it okay, I know it's a bit fuzzy. You'll see yourself there on the left-hand side as we look at that chart. Starts with Assistant Commissioner Travis Wurst, and then underneath is the Southern Command, or the Commander of Southern, Brad Curry. And then off to the left there is the Superintendent Southern Division and yourself, Superintendent Nobbs. Underneath you is Senior Sergeant Michael Potts. And then each of the stations are listed: Wallara, Papunya, Yuendamu, Alice Springs General Duties.
Yes, noted.
I'm trying to see this. The number of senior sergeants under your command at that time, is it just one?
Yes, correct.
And how many sergeants were under your command?
So I had 11 police stations and 6 police posts across my 400,000 square kilometres, which was my area of operation. So the 11 police stations, I had 2 substantive sergeants, which was Yuendamu and Yulara, and the other 9 police stations were remote sergeants. So they were senior constables or constables that are receive a special designation when they're operating within that police station. But once they leave that police station, they revert back to their nominal constable rank. So 9 remote sergeants, 2 substantive sergeants, and 6 police posts that I had obligations for, but that didn't have a substantive workforce within those.
You see in Alice Springs there were 3 sergeants there, correct?
No, Alice Springs have many more sergeants than
I
that,
see.
but this is, I guess, just a sort of indicative of the sort of broad structure. But Alice Springs have 5 different patrol groups, so there's 5 sergeants attached to that, and each of the watch houses have their own sergeant, so there's 20 plus sergeants within Alice Springs.
That can come down now. In your role then as superintendent, were you regularly meeting with your sergeants?
Yes.
In what forum?
So formally, we would have our what we'd call our task and coordination group meeting weekly. That would set the tempo for the week ahead. That would reflect on the week that's just passed. That would look at both operational and strategic priorities. It would look at gaps, risk, concerns or issues that the sergeants have. It would have some sort of broad assessment of some administrative matters. So that was sort of the predominant framework. Then would have sort of other frameworks, which might be work health and safety meetings that met quarterly, risk meetings that would meet periodically. And then outside of that, I consider myself a relatively approachable individual. So I had an open door policy and a capacity for anyone to call me at any time. Not attempting to subvert the command structure, but to, I guess, complement that and bring about outcomes, I guess.
In terms of, so you said that there was a weekly meeting, a task and coordination group meeting weekly?
Yes.
And all the sergeants would attend that?
Yes.
Including the sergeant who was the head of the IRT, is that right?
No.
I see.
No, the IRT is a sort of unique beast insofar as it's just a cadre of police members that are attached to Alice Springs General Duties that have went through some sort of recruitment process, receive advanced training, but then form up on an as-needs basis at the request of the end user, which is me if I required something within my area of operation.
But was the sergeant who was the head of the IRT also a substantive sergeant in the station?
Yes.
So would he happen to be at those meetings in any event?
He would have his own TCG process within their division. So my division TCG process was limited to my division.
So your weekly meetings were limited to your divisional sergeants?
So my 11 police stations, yes.
And how many other... I would draw that. So the sergeant who was head of the IRT in 2019, what weekly meetings would he be going to? Somebody else's TCG meeting, correct?
Correct. I'm not sure. That's a matter for the superintendent for the Alice Springs Operational Service Division, but I'd suggest there was a multitude of meetings that he would participate in within that broader portfolio.
Who was that superintendent in 2019?
Pauline Vickery.
We'll have the opportunity to ask Ms Vickery when she comes to give evidence. But do I take it from your earlier meetings that earlier evidence at those weekly meetings, in terms of the sergeants under your command, you never heard any racist language expressed?
Oh, certainly not. No.
And you never heard any negative, or I would draw that, you never heard any expressions about smashing up communities or wanting to use excessive force, is that right?
No.
In relation to your work in 2019, you were responsible for the 11 remote police stations and Yuendumu was one of them, correct?
Yes, correct.
How often did you visit Yuendumu in that time?
The first year, not as much as I would like. So in charge of 11 police stations, plus your general business continuity, it makes it really difficult to get to them. So maybe a couple of times in 2018. But from Christmas, so New Year 19 through to March, we had a fairly substantial spike in property crime within Yuendumu. We got to the stage where it was a week-on-week substantial increase in property crime instances. I then went out in the start of March to try to establish some framework to address and arrest the spiralling reports. I formed up a community safety, so the Yuendumu Community Safety Committee framework in March, and then from there I went out there fortnightly to try to drive the both operational and sort of strategic response to some of those property matters, which weren't limited to property. I guess there was some nuance within that as well. So, you know, social disorder and family issues. So that was a focus broadly within that framework.
So you identified as a superintendent that there were some particular issues for Yuendumu in terms of property crime, is that right?
Yeah, there was always issues in Yuendumu for property crime. It was always overrepresented across my crime data, but it became increasingly problematic over that summer period, post-Christmas, New Year's. That meant that we couldn't just keep doing what we were doing. We needed to do something decisive, and I went out there for a week in March to hopefully set the framework going forward, and then I'd go out there fortnightly thereafter.
Could you just remind us, Superintendent, what was the name of that meeting framework that you
It
developed?
was the Yuendumu Community Safety Committee framework.
And had you developed that sort of framework in other communities, or was this the first time?
No, look, there was nothing, I guess, unique about the framework. It just sought to leverage community integration and interoperability and more connectedness and communication. So it wasn't dissimilar to the Community Safety Action Plan framework that was already in existence, but the distinction, I guess, in this case is that it had a superintendent locally driving the objectives within the framework.
You were chairing that meeting, is that right?
Correct, yes.
Who attended?
So I guess as I went out there for that first week I guess I had 4 factors to consider. So I sent out a surge workforce, which was about high visibility patrolling to try to address the issues, to bring about some circuit breaker to break the issue. There was some broad-based community engagement, so multitude of community meetings that I participated in, including some media meetings, discrete conversations with clan groups and elders, broader conversations with some stakeholders around some target hardening strategies, so some of your repeat victim locations. And then from there, it was about the building the integrated interagency sort of framework. So to answer your question, it was your agencies that had some, sort of similar to your family safety framework, some statutory obligations, but then you also had your sort of periphery agencies as well, such as your WIDACs, your Southern Tenamite Coogee, your Centrelink. So it was a more sort of comprehensive group, but it also had some elders within that as well, so such as Mr. Eddie Robertson and people such as that.
You regarded Eddie Robertson, I would draw that, you still regard Eddie Robertson as an important and well-respected elder, is that right?
Yeah, he's a man that I have the utmost respect for, and been the privilege to have many conversations with him over the time, and have learnt a lot from him. So he is pro-police, and had a sort of pragmatic attitude towards things. So yes.
Were there other prominent elders who would attend those meetings?
Mr. Williams come to, but by and large, not really well attended within the community space.
Do you know why that is when you're trying to get buy-in from the local community?
Look, I guess that's a really difficult one to answer. It's something that I've sort of grappled with for many years in many locations, not just Yuendamu. Every framework that we build is built around the importance of local decision making and community buy-in, because that's where the answers are. If I had to provide an answer, my answer would be that there's an overproliferation of these frameworks within communities, and to me, that makes it really problematic. Community members' time is equally as important as mine, and they're not remunerated to go to these meetings. There's one meeting in Yuendamu and it's not just Yuendamu, it's across the broader area. It's the local authority meeting. That's relatively well attended by community members. They're remunerated to participate in that. But the other meetings, I could count 4, 5, 6 meetings within Yuendamu that replicate the same intention, it's and all of them, notwithstanding their sort of importance and recognition of the importance of local decision makers within the framework, all of them struggle with the same basis, that they have no community buy-in.
That's an interesting reflection, that you agree that the time and skill level should be rewarded if you're asking Aboriginal people to come and do such an important role.
Agreed.
It sounds from the evidence you've previously given that you absolutely accept that decision making should be local, and that Aboriginal people should be empowered to make decisions about their own communities, correct?
Oh, 100%.
You're familiar with the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, is that right?
Yes, I had the pleasure of working with Leanne Little over the last 10 years, albeit not so much over the most recent years, but around the inception and some of the consultations around the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, and it was quite informative to be part of the community-based consultations around that, just to see and hear firsthand the community's desire and expectations around those models.
What did you take from listening to the community about what they want?
I guess it was a bit of an eye-opener for me. You sort of frustratingly view, and probably arrogantly, that some of these communities are disengaged and disempowered, but there is genuinely a want to be part of the conversation and part of the solution. So it's just where we fail is the next step to actually integrate the local decision makers into the framework, and I think that's because we apply a too rigid lens to it.
You've got. Can I suggest to your superintendent some really important reflections about this to give, given your experiences in the community? I'm not asking you to come up with a solution on the spot, but are you part of an ongoing conversation about how a community like Yuendamu can empower local decision making?
I guess, one of the things I tell my constables and my sergeants all the time, so I try to continue to push the community safety action plan framework. That's, I guess, the police framework. It's, we hold the mandate of community safety, notwithstanding I agree and continue to assert that community safety is broader than police. It's a whole community thing. But my police officers still have this sort of prevailing attitude that a community safety meeting is 3 o'clock on Tuesday at a basketball court, and then a surprise month after month when no one turns up. So I guess what I tried to encourage them to do within that sort of construct is say a community safety meeting doesn't have to be a one meeting in that traditional sense. It could be a multitude of conversations with leaders that we then seek to consolidate the learnings from those conversations, and that effectively becomes the community safety meeting. So bringing the conversation to the people, I guess, for the lack of a better term, than simply saying, well, it's now 3:05, no one's here, so let's wrap up and go home. But so I guess that's there's a bit of a legacy around that, and it's an attempt to re-educate my workforce around that. But the community safety action plan for me, it's critical, critically important, and the answers are within the community. It's not within police.
When you had the fortnightly meetings in Yuendamu in 2019 in response to the property damage, was the ACPO there with you?
He was always in the station, but rarely participated. No.
And do you know why that is?
Not sure. Derek is a sort of quiet, unassuming individual and likes to just get on and get the job done. And he's one that I've found greater success in pulling him aside and saying, "Hey, Derek, what do I do for this? Give me some advice," rather than being front and centre within a meeting where I put an emphasis on, "Now give us the answers, Derek." So I guess that's kind of what my thinking has always been around Derek and my experience with Derek.
Did you ever get to the bottom of what were the cause of the property crime?
Well, it's.
I'll go back a step. That might be too philosophical, but firstly, what sort of properties were being broken into when you talk about that Christmas period and up till March 2019?
Soft targets. So repeat victim locations. So the community stores, both community stores, multiple times over. Some of the service providers' locations, a number of times over. Commercial locations. So predominantly commercial, but occasionally service providers, and generally over prevalence of like teachers' accommodations and things such as that when school holiday period's on and everyone leaves communities.
Do you recall any break-in of the houses of the clinic staff?
I'm sorry, I couldn't answer that. It's certainly acknowledged break-ins of clinic staff over the years, but whether it was within that discrete crime series, I'm not too sure.
Do you recall any discussion at that meeting that it was predominantly young people who were involved?
Yeah, the focus of that meeting for me wasn't just sort of arbitrary adult, so under age. We kind of focused from adolescents up to 25. So the premise of this meeting was about trying to identify your core cohort of repeat offenders, and then dealing, and that's not the right term, but dealing with that, supporting that cohort from an end-to-end model. So early intervention, engagement, all the way through to tactical enforcement and repeat offender management. So an end-to-end framework, but plugging in things like, how do we get this person to school, or how do we... So there were the sort of focuses within that framework, but it wasn't just an arbitrary youth by our definition.
Can we safely assume that it was people under the age of 25 who were doing most of the break-ins?
Yes.
And did it come to your attention that some of the break-ins were for the purposes of looking for alcohol in houses where people had permits to have alcohol?
Potentially.
Was that a significant reason that the break-ins were occurring, do you believe?
One of the many reasons.
In other cases, it was to get food from the store, is that right?
Food from the store, yep, correct.
And when you talk about soft targets, you're talking about houses where there are material possessions likely to be, like in the houses of nurses or teachers?
Yeah, when I say soft targets, I'm more talking about where there is a vulnerability at a location and they continue to exploit that vulnerability, and despite us having conversations with the owners of those premises around target hardening or SEPTEB audits or resolving those vulnerabilities, they would still be exploited. It could be an insubstantial tin roof that could easily be pried open, or things such as that.
And Her Honour has some evidence of angle grinders being used for the break-ins. So was that happening?
It does, but again, that I won't say a degree of sophistication, that demonstrates a little bit more degree of planning. Most of it didn't have that degree of sophistication. It was sort of crude, blunt instruments to affect entry.
Did you have a perception of how many people under the age of 25 were engaged in repeat offending property offences?
Our focus remained on 10, so the top 10 within that community safety framework. But that fluctuated in terms of one transitioning out and then a new one coming in. So there was probably a cohort of 20 young people within the community that had varying degrees of recidivism.
And during the course of those meetings, you said there were a number of different stakeholders there. Was the school represented there?
Yes.
And Widak was represented there?
Yes.
And frequently Eddie was there as a community member?
Yes.
Correct? The clinic staff, did they attend?
Yes. Again, not every meeting had full representation, so depending on what was occurring within the community at the relevant time would dictate what attendance would look like. But it was relatively well attended, and I kind of enforced that to be the case. So I'd remind them that I was coming out the next day and reassert my expectations in terms of attendance.
And was there a representative of the council there?
So you'd have Southern Tanami Kuriji representing sort of the council. So Yuendamu was somewhat sort of unique. So Yuendamu sat under the Central Desert Regional Shire, but, and I might be getting my terminology not correct here, but a lot of those sort of key aspects were outsourced to the Southern Tanami Kuriji around safety patrol and mediation and things such as that. So the Shire, in the context of Yuendamu, was more around municipal matters. So they rarely would attend on that basis, unless we had some sort of environmental issue that we wanted to resolve.
Was there a representative from the Southern Tanami Kuriji?
Yes.
To attend? Who was that?
Now you're testing me. Chantel, I think. Sorry.
An Aboriginal person or a non-Aboriginal person?
I'm not too sure.
Right.
I don't believe she was an Aboriginal lady.
So I'm going to go back to my causal question. There's any number of reasons, and they might be many and varied, but as to why that group of 10 to 20 people were repeatedly breaking in. It could be boredom, substance abuse, mental health or behavioural issues, lack of parental control. Was there any work to try and get to the bottom of that cause?
Yes, there was. Quite often, I wanted the framework to be a sort of action-orientated conversation. So it might have been the case if we had a young person in, I might say, health, please give me an assessment as to whether FASD or there's any other cognitive issues. So they would go away and assess that. I'd say to Territory Families, I want some advice as to whether there's any active CP cases, so child protection cases ongoing, and what were the outcomes around that. school, please tell me what the attendance is, and have we linked into WANTA, I think they're called, in terms of the early morning school program. So we were attempting to sort of try to look across the whole spectrum of issues that might influence the young person, and then try to wrap around as best we can in a sort of fulsome response to hopefully bring about some change and support.
Did you feel over what period of time when you were there were those meetings conducted leading up to November 2019?
So from March, I don't think they went all the way to November, but yeah, for a long time.
I think the last one prior to the tragedy of the 9th of November was the 30th of October, and for a particular reason you were called elsewhere.
No, I think that one you're referring to is the family safety framework.
see.
It's another framework entirely.
So focusing on those community meetings then, at any stage over that period, did you feel like you were making any progress in terms of reducing the number of break-ins?
Oh, look, certainly we reduced the number. Well, sorry, it's cyclical. But I think where I probably achieved more was having a better appreciation across the service provider footprint in terms of the things that they need. So we weren't just focusing on the youth and how we support the youth, but we're also focusing on how do we better problem identify the environmental issues that are impacting on this. So it was about me holding them and them holding me accountable for some of the other things that I say we should be doing around X, Y, and Z issue.
Identifying the problem is one thing, and then finding solutions is more difficult. But was one problem you identified overcrowding in houses, which would then sometimes lead to young people leaving the house overnight?
Look, I've always noted overcrowding as a perennial issue across everywhere. I guess our focus was trying to be on what we can do at a local level to move the needle. That's a more sort of systemic, complex issue than was within our operational mandate.
Let me touch on one issue which might be in your operational mandate. If you found out, for example, this is just hypothetical, that a young person aged 12 or 13 was wandering around the community and breaking into houses because they were being subjected to violence or neglect, mistreatment at home, you could try and stage an intervention around that young person, is that right?
Yes, correct.
And that might involve, for example, WIDAC and the school and another intervention or the clinic?
Generally in that case it would be, again, we were sort of I'd like to say a finely tuned cog. We all had our important part to play in that broader piece. So if we had the scenario that you just outlined, it would be a whole set of concurrent actions. So I'd be saying to health, please give me an insight into the history of this young person to assess whether there is or anything we should or shouldn't be doing to support them from a cognitive or medical perspective. But then I'd be, WIDAC, what can we do to engage this person? School, how do we engage them to go to school? Territory families, is there an open CP case and what can we do around that? Then I'd be going to police, how can we do something from a role modelling perspective? How can we have a conversation with this young person? I always apply the sort of philosophy that you can't be what you can't see. So I wanted my police to engage the young people to see that we aren't Jody Nobbs, the police officer in the community. I'm Jody Nobbs, who happens to wear a uniform but genuinely cares and wants to have a conversation with you. So I would often say to my police, I don't care if you come to work tomorrow in your PT gear and you kick the footy all day. If opportunity presents, go do it. So that's the sort of things that we're trying to build within the framework to try to role model, mentor, change the trajectory or attitude of a young person.
In that particular meeting group, did you have a representative from military families?
Yes.
They play a critical role, don't they, in that scenario that I just mentioned of a young person who's being subjected to neglect or mistreatment?
Yes, so no more critical than any of the other cogs, but certainly a critical cog within the machine. So
getting those stakeholders to work together effectively is key to changing the trajectory of a person who's offending like that. Do you agree?
Yeah, agreed. And it was like initially it was setting it up was really difficult because we had a lot of people that had sort of different outlooks and philosophies on certain things. So there were some robust conversations in the early stages in terms of let's park that and let's just focus on what we all consider as being the best interests of the individual, and we're all sitting at the table because we all genuinely care. So let's see, and I feel that we've sort of formed some good, respectful, mutual accountable relationships from that.
Do you recall the representative of the WIDAC who were there?
Sawana, I can't remember.
Sinana?
Sorry, Sinana, my apologies, yes.
And Ashley Jansen, was he there at any?
He didn't participate in that, but he had a very active interaction with the local police.
Move to another topic, but still on meetings for the moment. The Yunnamoo Family Safety Framework was also a meeting that you chaired, correct?
Yes, correct.
And that was fortnightly, correct?
Correct, yes.
And that's the one where you said the meeting prior to the 9th of November was the 30th of October 2019. You had some operational priorities in Yulara and you couldn't attend on that date. Did you otherwise attend that regularly?
Yes, so the vast majority of the meetings I attended and chaired, but my proxy was Senior Sergeant Potts, so he would attend in my absence on the rare occasion that I was unavailable.
How did that meeting differ from the one you just told us about?
Well, that meeting, so the other one was about let's be open, honest, frank, and have a meaningful, wholesome conversation about how do we address some of the issues central to people. But the family safety framework was very limited in its composition. It was the sort of agencies that have some sort of statutory or regulatory obligation around domestic violence. So again, the underpinning construct of the meeting was the same insofar as a integrated interagency meeting where we try to do intensive case management to try to address, pervasive issues within the pervasive domestic violence issues within the community.
What stakeholders would attend?
So that would be WIDAC, some of your DV advocacy services operating in Alice Springs, although they would go out there to do advocacy, so like your women's shelter, police obviously, corrections, so facilitate things like release from prisoner notifications and things such as that. So WIDAC, police, health, territory families, some of the DV advocacy services. It's pretty limited to that.
Any Aboriginal elders or emerging leaders?
No, none at all.
Why not?
Well, as I touched on, it was very constrained to those that have some statutory obligation.
I see.
We were discussing quite sensitive and pertinent issues about the compositions of families and some of the challenges. We had information sharing protocols across that framework or across that cohort, but that didn't extend beyond that cohort.
Did Derek attend those meetings?
No.
And why was that?
Again, for the same reason I expressed before, it's I had the feeling, and maybe that's just my interpretation, that he had better engagement, involvement at a interpersonal level, one-on-one, than sitting in a room where we deferred to Derek as the person required to give the answers for some complex issues.
Was there a meeting separate to the structures you've just talked about, which then did engage Aboriginal elders other than Eddie, who was coming?
That's the CSAP framework. So that's it's been done for a very long time. Again, not very good. That's the sort of. So what we focus on in the CSAP framework was or is alcohol, domestic violence, amenity, and social order. So those sorts of. Again, it's supposed to be about problem solving. It's supposed to be about identifying issues.
Can I just ask, is CSAP the same as the Community Safety Action Framework?
No, you're on. Community Safety Action Plan. So the one.
And is that the is that the meeting that you've already told us about?
No, Your Honour. This is my point in terms of this over-representation of meetings across these communities. But CSAP is a meeting that's held in all communities. It's been going for a long time. It's a police-driven conversation. The community safety meeting I spoke about before is limited to Yuendamu, and that was the one driven by me in response to a need, which was at the time the property crime matters, but then I guess became something that we continue to work through, given its relative success. So but the CSAP one is the one that I've said to my sergeants, you really need to rethink the way that you engage within a CSAP construct. It shouldn't be a 3 o'clock meeting at a basketball court.
What does CSAP stand for?
Community Safety Action Plan.
And
Can I ask, the community meeting that you told us about is focusing on the top 10 young people who were coming to police attention within a cohort of potentially 20 young people. Is Kumanjayi Walker one of those persons in the 10 or 20?
No, Your Honour. He was a person that I think the lady Charmaine raised a couple of times, but no, he wasn't on that framework. I think he spent some of his time, and I could be wrong here, but incarcerated whilst that was operational. But I'm not 100% there.
just checking those records.
But he was a person who was being considered as part of the family safety framework.
Very, very much so, Your Honour, over a long time, and probably my most challenging person within that framework.
So just before I move on from meetings, Superintendent, the CSAP, you said it's held in all communities. It's been going for a long time. It's not particularly effective. Is it, again, stakeholders?
The design, it's supposed to be everyone. The design is that it's the bringing together the community to have, so it's the typical what community people refer to as a community meeting. So it's where community representation is strong is when communities say, we've got an issue, we've got to have a community meeting. They then drive when is the community meeting occur, and then generally there's a relatively good turnout. But the CSAP that we've identified that we arbitrarily say will occur at this particular time, by and large is not well attended, although some communities it's really well attended. So, Titchkala CSAP is very, very well attended. So there's varying degrees of success, but I often find that the degree of success is generally driven by the sergeant and the engagement, and probably to a lesser extent how connected the community may or may not be.
Do you recall how often it met in the lead up to November 2019?
Oh, it's supposed to meet monthly.
And did you attend those meetings?
No.
Ever? I see. Are you aware of which community leaders from Yuendamu attended those meetings?
That's my point is I don't think very many, if any. Again, if there was an emerging issue, maybe, but I can't definitively say.
Do you agree with me that it's often the case that Aboriginal elders are asked to do a lot over various different committees, often unremunerated?
Agree.
And it's a big strain often on members of the community.
Certainly it is.
And so that whole concept needs to be looked at, doesn't it, if we want to get proper community engagement and buy-in?
Agreed. Look, I wasn't invited, despite my protest, to the local authority meetings. They were a sort of local government controlled meeting, but that was the meeting where community are remunerated for attending. Where I've managed to, from time to time, to get myself onto the agenda to have a conversation if there was an issue. So it wasn't uncommon from time to time that community within that framework might express some law and order issues. Then the local authority would send me a letter. I'd then provide a response 2 months later, and it just wasn't sort of practical in terms of giving meaningful response to issues. So what I said in some locations, if we felt that there was likely to be a law and order issue, please invite me, I'll come, I'll go at the start of the agenda, I'll have my say, answer some questions, give some reassurances, then I'd leave. But I'd find the limited interactions I'd have in those framework that it was really considered conversations because of the representation within the room.
Do you actually remember now attending any local authority meeting in Yuendamu?
No, never.
We know that Kumanjayi, just checking the record, was remanded in custody from July 2018 until the 27th of December 2018, and then he was remanded in custody again from the 19th of March 2019. Over that period, it's really just 2.5 months, January, February, and part of March. Do you recall Kumanjayi coming to your attention at any of the times when you went out to meetings in Yuendamu?
Yeah, I certainly recall Kumanjayi being discussed within that Community Safety Committee meeting, predominantly by, again, the name escapes me, I think it was Charmaine. She was the lady that done sort of sand play and some of the other sort of things around healing, and she would raise Kumanjayi from time to time, but
that was in the context of his relationship with Rakisha, is that right?
correct, but we generally had most of our conversations around Kumanjayi within the family safety framework.
Just before the break, can I ask you, in relation to the family safety network, was part of the purpose of, thank you, Your Honour, in relation to that framework, the Yuendamu family safety framework, in relation to the discussions amongst stakeholders, was it part of the goal to educate the person who was perpetrating the violence and to support them to not continue that violence? Or was it more about removing the victim from them? No,
it was more of an intensive case management. So it was more about the intensive case management of a particular issue. It wasn't about the sort of long term. So it again also had a end-to-end philosophy around how do we do some early interventions, establishing safety plans, looking at some needs of the family from a CP perspective, but then also at the other end of the equation, the repeat offender management aspects as well. So targeting of the offender, including, what does prisoner debriefing look like before he leaves the prison, try to get an appreciation of what his sort of attitudes are towards the victim at the time, making sure that there was domestic violence orders in place, making sure that there was a safety plan, making sure the victim was sufficiently engaged and notified of the impending release, and then helping, I guess, to integrate the subject back into community, and then doing some preemptive repeat offender engagements and repeat victim support. So that's sort of the basis of it. But once we were satisfied that we had a end-to-end support framework in place, they were integrated off the framework, and then it became general business for your child protection or the other statutory agencies just to do their general business.
How long have you been working with the frameworks?
So when I took over the role as the superintendent, I took over the role as the chair of that framework. So it was part of my portfolio responsibility.
Are there similar safety frameworks in each of the 11 communities?
No, it's so from a remote policing perspective, Yuendamu, certainly in the Southern Desert, is the only place that has it. So there's a family safety framework in Alice Springs. There's a family safety framework in Yuendamu. There's one in Tennant Creek. There's one in Nullarbor. There's one in Darwin. One in Catherine, but outside that, there's not too many. It's at a regional level.
Is there one in Wadair?
I'm not sure. Sorry.
Have you had an experience of where you're working with, you understand the dynamic of a couple who are the subject of the safety framework, and it is effective getting those stakeholders together to stop the cycle of violence?
Agreed. The benefit of getting the integrated consideration and response is key to the early interventions and engagement. So it's us not responding to the trauma after it's occurred, it's us preventing the trauma from occurring. So it's doing the best we can to put all the frameworks in place to support the reunification of the family, generally post the release of the individual from incarceration.
Are you familiar with the work done pursuant to the AJA of the development of law and justice groups?
Only in a sort of conceptual construct. I haven't seen the operational framework that will underpin that.
As a conceptual framework, do you agree that that's an important way to ensure the safety of a community?
Yes.
Your Honour, is that a convenient time to break?
It is. We'll break.